example, the Vancouver model, looking into how the CCP does this. And so, of course, Canada plays a big role in Chinese criminal enterprise tied in with the fentanyl trade. And if they want to try to tackle that, actually, it's a big deal. But on that note, too, China going to Canada, China going very heavily to Mexico, these will probably become much bigger issues, as well as other areas like Cuba, for example, where they're trying to make deeper relations as well. Because what happens is this: the Chinese Communist Party's theory of war under former CCP leader Mao Zedong was surround the cities with the countryside. Surround the cities with the countryside. In other words, and rather than go after the cities, right, of course, during the Chinese Civil War, where the CCP was trying to establish its power, they went after the countryside, where they could more easily gain ground, more easily take things. And by taking the countryside, they were able to isolate the cities, which made it so they choked them out. They have the same idea with the United States. Part of the idea with the United States is the CCP is going to Latin America very heavily. The CCP is going to Canada, trying to make deals there. And by, of course, going to the countries nearby the United States, they can cut off the United States in terms of relations with its neighbors. They've done this, again, very heavily in South America, parts of Central America, and they've been trying to do it more heavily in Canada and in Mexico.
Like America's been
the
ignoring
CCP, in addition to going after the U.S. and Canada and so on just recently, also made a deal with the Philippines to cool their tensions over disputed territories in the South China Sea.
20 years or
the Philippines
so? 30?
occupies the second Thomas Shoal, but China also claims it. And remember, look, earlier, just recently, in June this year, Chinese Coast Guards on motorboats repeatedly rammed and then boarded Philippine Navy boats. This was allegedly to prevent the transferring of food and other supplies to the Filipino Navy personnel at the BRP Sierra Madre. That's a ship they have an outpost on in that shoal. They ran it aground and made it like a base. But this cooling of tensions now between the CCP and the Philippines and the South China Sea is interesting, considering, again, how big of an issue the CCP's claims of the South China Sea are. They view the South China Sea as being part of their, historical ownership. This was, of course, rejected in certain claims, including by international courts, but the CCP is doing it regardless. And so for the CCP to just back off of that at this very key moment when tensions were reaching a boiling point, for the CCP to back off, that's a significant change in policy. So again, this charm campaign taking place all at once, right, at the same time, cooling of relations, trying to target individual U.S. states, making kind of peace with the Philippines, at least temporarily. And then what else is happening? The Chinese Communist Party suddenly as well is now reaching out to India. And what the Economist frames as part of a charm offensive to try to cool tensions with India as well. And notably, again, with India, the CCP also has territorial disputes. Now, according to The Economist, it says, in May, a new Chinese ambassador, Xu Feihong, arrived in Delhi after a hiatus of 18 months in which China's embassy there operated without one. Mr. Xu has since been on a charm offensive, meeting several members of the political elite. Again, the CCP suddenly is changing a lot of its policies, and it's trying to charm countries that have become a little more tense with it. Now, again, the list of recent CCP moves like this, it could go on for a while. They're launching a charm campaign right now. Now, like many of these recent moves, they would be viewed as very drastic shifts in terms of the trend the CCP was on even just a few weeks ago. But again, it follows in the wake of the third plenum and of the CCP trying to woo foreign firms to come back to China. The CCP is trying to save its economy. And so they're putting on a smiley face and going to people they were just recently starting conflicts with and saying, hey, business is back on the table. That's the move they're doing right now. But the problem is, it's two-faced, as it often is. Let me explain. Now, look, briefly, even internally, the Chinese Communist Party is trying to get entrepreneurs to take action. And it's trying to convince the Chinese people to start spending their money again. And all of this, both inside China and outside China, looks again like a new type of charm campaign.
Yep.
Now, on this, it looks also like it's not working. The Chinese Communist Party is not actually changing anything, really, in terms of its economy. The new push for domestic manufacturing, The regime wants to break its dependence on foreign goods. They're trying to, again, break even from Western technology. They don't want China to be dependent on anything from outside China. But it was already trying to do this. It was already trying to save its, ailing real estate sector. It was already trying to blunt its looming banking crisis, to get people spending money again. And already, the methods it had tried were not working. Even if we just go by the unreliable surface numbers, it was not working. And the third plenum, where they were supposed to announce a big plan to change things, didn't introduce any changes to what was already not working. Now, look, the analysis that swept Western media after the CCP's third plenum was that it did not provide any kind of strategy or roadmap to do things differently. Nothing tangible was done to actually fix the economic problems. And instead, as I've been mentioning, it talked about so-called social stability, domestic productivity, and a very, very big emphasis, maybe most importantly, on so-called socialism with Chinese characteristics. They just strengthened the rule of the Communist Party over the society. Now, in some ways, it seems the new agenda of the third plenum is more to prepare China for the inevitable. The Communist Party seems to realize it has no way out of the current economic troubles. The regime seems to be aware that if it continues growing more hostile on the world stage, it will continue to isolate itself from the free world. And it seems to understand as well that it's just creating an economic narrative to usher in this inevitable scenario. And the inevitable seems to be coming fast. I'll be talking more about this and the expected U.S. sanctions on China after we come back from a quick break. Welcome back. The Chinese Communist Party right now is launching a charm campaign, and they're targeting foreign leaders and foreign investors. But is this in order to prepare China for the inevitable economic crisis that's happening? Well, it seems this inevitable is coming fast. In addition to the already struggling Chinese economy, there's also the expected case that it's going to get worse. Part of this has to do with the growing trade disputes. And another big part is on the CCP's growing military threats on the global stage. So I briefly mentioned the CCP is putting on a smiley face diplomatically, but on the other side, it's actually becoming extremely aggressive, more so than before. And it's on that latter note that the United States is right now planning for more sanctions on the Chinese Communist Party. Now, look, remember, NATO just recently, they determined that the Chinese Communist Party is enabling Russia's war in Ukraine. And this means that if they want to end the war on their terms and not the CCP's terms, because again, you have two competing peace deals, one from the free world, one from the CCP, and the CCP again is trying to make it on its terms, then they need to stop the thing that's enabling Russia's war. They need to go after the thing that's letting it happen. So how do they do that? Well, they need to hit the Chinese economy. If the CCP is enabling the war, then the CCP is the way they stop the war, in other words. And word has it, they may even target Chinese banks. Now, just a few days ago, U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said that at the Aspen Security Forum that the U.S. is preparing additional sanctions on Chinese entities that are supporting Russia in the war with Ukraine. Watch.
China continues to be a major supplier of dual-use items to Russia's war machine. And we think China should stop because we think it is profoundly outside of the bounds of decent conduct by nation states, and China should not be on Team Russia when it comes to the war in Ukraine. I would reinforce here. In terms of next steps, what we have shown over time is that we have been prepared to tighten the screws, to apply sanctions against specific entities and individuals, including in China as well as in other countries, and that pattern will continue as we go forward. I think you can expect to see additional sanctions measures as we watch this picture continue to evolve in the coming weeks.
And here's more on U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan's comments from Bloomberg. They said U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said the U.S. is preparing new sanctions on Chinese entities that support Russia's war in Ukraine, and hinted that banks may be in the crosshairs. And he pointed to President Joe Biden's executive order late last year that allowed the U.S. Treasury Department to go after banks facilitating dual-use items aiding Russia's defense industry, and added that these powers had not been granted for nothing. And that's important because, again, what the CCP is being accused of is providing Russia with dual-use technologies. Dual-use meaning, they look benign on the surface, but you can use them for military equipment. And so in order to stop the arms trade happening right now, they have to go against these dual-use type technologies. While other senior U.S. officials at notes, including Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, have warned Beijing about potential sanctions, Sullivan's comments suggest new steps are near. It's coming from multiple directions, in other words. And look, a blow to Chinese banks right now, that would be devastating to the Chinese Communist Party and to its ambitions. Remember, right now, the Chinese Communist Party is facing a banking and debt crisis. And it needs the banks because, of course, that has to do with how it bails out the local Chinese provinces and local governments, which are also facing economic crisis because they were using these big, mega city projects and so on, building ghost cities and roads to nowhere and so on, and airports in the middle of nowhere. But they were doing it on debt, and the debt bubble is exploding, and that's, of course, causing the banking crisis. If they go after the banks, it's going to burst that bubble, or could at least, depending on how far they go with it. But it also looks at the sanctions and tariffs. They're not going to be limited to just the CCP backing Russia's war either. That's one part of it, a big part of it. But there's other stuff as well. The trade war is looking to expand elsewhere. Already, it seems that investors are bracing for this. On semiconductors, for example, the chips you need for your electronics and your phones and high-tech equipment, notably even like missiles. The U.S. is considering tougher trade rules to rein in the Chinese chip industry, and investors are getting ready for it. BBC said this. They said technology stocks around the world have slumped on fears about the global computer chip industry. The sell-off came after a report that the Biden administration could be set to further tighten restrictions on exports of semiconductor equipment to China. In the U.S., it says the tech-heavy NASDAQ index closed at 2.7% lower on Wednesday, while chip stocks have also tumbled in Europe and Asia. And look, note this as well, when it comes to U.S. policies, countries will sometimes just wait for things to change. Situations can change, in the U.S., depending on who's in office. If it's Republicans, they have one policy. If it's Democrats, they have another. And so if countries don't like U.S. policy, they just wait. They wait 4 years, they wait 8 years, they wait for our midterm elections, and then they expect policies to change depending on who the people are. Now look, with the U.S. presidential elections coming up, though, the Chinese Communist Party doesn't seem to have a lot of hope that the tough trading policies it's finding right now under Biden would change even if Trump came back in. It is a bipartisan issue. Republicans and Democrats are mostly on the same page when it comes to the CCP. Again, we'll see what happens with the elections, but hypothetically, if Trump does come back in, Trump is vowing much higher tariffs on Chinese-made cars, and his new running mate, J.D. Vance, has been fairly tough on the CCP. Vance even wants the U.S. military to focus on the Chinese Communist Party as a threat greater than Russia. He wants to shift the focus from Russia to the CCP. And notably, that seems to be a broadening position, especially with NATO now determining that the CCP is the enabler of Russia's war. FBI Director Christopher Wray, who again was under Trump and now under Biden, he has named the Chinese Communist Party as the primary threat to the United States. Now, back to that charm campaign of the CCP, the regime is now playing a very different tune. They're talking about peace and cooperation, at least on the surface. But the question is whether there's anything behind this. Now, look, remember, the pending sanctions are about the CCP fueling Russia's war in Ukraine. The sanctions and tariffs, the ones pending right now, will very likely get a lot worse if the Chinese Communist Party does not back off its support for Russia and enabling the war. And it seems basically that's not on the CCP's agenda. The Chinese Communist Party is not showing any signs that it's going to be changing that. Actually, if anything, it's showing signs that it's going to expand its hostilities. The Chinese Communist Party is getting more militarily aggressive on the global stage. Here's how it's positioning itself at the recent NATO meeting, for example. South China Sea said Chinese and Belarusian troops have simulated the capture of an airport in an exercise near the border with Poland and Ukraine, days after NATO denounced Beijing as a decisive enabler of Russia's war effort. Now look, on Taiwan, here's how the Chinese Communist Party is positioning itself when the U.S. is helping bolster Taiwanese defense. The Guardian said that China has suspended talks of arms control and nuclear proliferation with the U.S. in protest of arms sales to Taiwan. And it's further in that in response, U.S. State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller accused China of following Russia's lead by holding arms control negotiations hostage to other conflicts in the bilateral relationship. Now, it's that China is estimated to have 500 nuclear warheads, but the U.S. Department of Defense expects Beijing to produce more than 1,000 by 2030. Now, look, here's just one of the many recent examples on how the CCP is reacting to other countries when they show support for Taiwan. Euronews said that after Ursula von der Leyen was re-elected as president of the European Commission, the Chinese Communist Party made threatening statements over her support for Taiwan. The Chinese Communist Party's Director General for European Affairs of the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they responded saying this: playing with fire on Taiwan is highly dangerous, suggesting, of course, they were threatening Europe because of that. And then look, in addition to the CCP enabling Russia's war, there's also now news saying the CCP has been playing a role to aid Hamas, the terror group in the Israel-Hamas war. Newsweek reports that the Chinese Communist Party has been selling cyber weapons to Hamas. So this is not just one area they're doing this, in other words. And look, aside from the growing threat of isolation the CCP is now facing, it's also taking steps to create a kind of alternate world order. This was one of the big plans, in fact, announced at the recent Shanghai Cooperation Organization, just ahead of the third plenum. The Chinese Communist Party, alongside Russia and other countries in their orbit, are working to form new trade and security alliances. And this is being framed as Russia and China trying to create a rival to NATO. And remember, the CCP's involvement with the Russian military, again, is one of the things causing a lot of its troubles right now. A new Eurasian security alliance with them would likely expand that problem in the eyes of the free world, not make it better. NATO would very likely regard them as even more of a threat were they to do that. Well, everyone, that's all for tonight. Thank you for joining us, and as always, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free.